In modern, civilized America, skin color can still be enough of a reason for a police officer to draw a gun on someone, even if that person is simply watering flowers in front of their own home. But Simone Bennett was never the kind of weak woman who would let herself be insulted or bullied by the police. With her intellect and position, she forced an entire system to bow down and answer for its superiority complex toward black people. What can one woman do to make sure no one can keep ignoring the issue of racism in today's America? Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Stay until the end. This is one story that won't disappoint. The iron gate slid open smoothly to one side, revealing a gleaming stone-paved road leading into Windmere Grove, a neighborhood so polished that even the bricks on the street looked as if they were wiped down each morning. Simone Bennett didn't need a map to find her way. She had memorized every turn back at the base. Her husband, Marcus Bennett, said nothing as he drove, hands gripping the steering wheel just firmly enough, eyes glancing past the pristine white fences and the eerily identical two-story homes that lined the street like replicas with no soul. They were the only black family in this neighborhood, and they had known it from the moment the gate opened. The first glances weren't exactly hostile, but they couldn't be mistaken for friendly either. An old woman watering her flowers froze mid-mashin, her hose tipping sideways and sending water spraying across the lawn. A man in a golf outfit paused mid-step, tracking their SUV from one end of the road to the other without blinking once. And in the third house on the left, a child sitting on a skateboard looked up, then bolted inside like he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. Simone didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Every tiny gesture said more than enough. They had moved here through a security relocation program, a special arrangement for high-ranking military personnel, especially those still active in sensitive units like Delta Force. On paper, it was a humanitarian and practical policy, reducing risks in case residential addresses were exposed to hostile actors. In reality, it felt more like a test of endurance, placing a black family right in the center of a community where every wall was built from white privilege. On the first day, no one said hello. On the second day, their mailbox didn't receive the HOA flyers that every other house got. On the third, their trash bin was dragged back to the curb earlier than usual, even though Marcus clearly remembered putting it away the night before. None of it was serious enough to cause a confrontation, but all of it added up to one message: you don't belong here. Simone had lived on military bases, served in the harshest combat zones, negotiated amid gunfire and among people unsure if they'd live to see tomorrow. But nothing compared to Windmere Grove. Here, every threat was coded in civility, wrapped in faint smiles and sterile pleasantries, as if programmed to be polite. No one shouted in their faces, they were simply erased from the community's daily rhythms. And to Simone, that was more dangerous than a loaded weapon. She stood in the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand, looking out the wide window facing the backyard. Marcus was installing security cameras along the fence, murmuring to himself as he checked the angles. He didn't ask anything, didn't mention the neighbor's silence, the look during the HOA meeting they weren't invited to, or the car that drove by too slowly past their house at midnight. But Simone knew, he felt it all, and he was trying to cope in the most practical way he could. The first week passed in a heavy silence, until the 8th morning, when Simone stepped outside to pick up the newspaper blown beneath the maple tree in front of the house. Beneath the paper was an old brown envelope. No name, no stamp, no return address. She opened it with the same careful motion she used for military documents. Inside was a single printed line: "This neighborhood is for decent people, not your kind with guns." No exclamation point, no messy handwriting. The letters were printed clean, cold, and lifeless, just like the street they now lived on. Simone didn't frown, didn't crumple the paper. She read it, folded it in half, and slipped it into her back pocket as if it were just another utility bill to keep on file. She didn't tell Marcus that night, not because she was afraid, but because she had expected it. Life had taught her there would always be a message like this, Maybe in a stare, a passing comment in a crowd, or a piece of paper like this one. The form changed, but the meaning stayed the same. Her skin said more than her resume ever could. In modern America, skin color isn't just biology, it's social identity. The average white American earns nearly 50% more than a person of color. A black person with a college degree is still 3 times more likely to be denied a rental than a white person with only a high school education. And in communities like Windermere Grove, where homes are built on community standards, that standard is often just a coded way to say, "Not you." Simone knew that, but she also knew something else. Silence is how the racists test you, before they strike, and the test had officially begun. She locked the backyard gate and looked up at the sky, so clear it felt soulless without a single cloud. But inside her, another kind of cloud was quietly forming, a sense that the wind was changing, and it wasn't bringing anything good. The envelope remained in her pocket, and Simone knew it wasn't just a message. It was the death notice of the last bit of innocence she had left about what it meant to come home. Ever since that anonymous note arrived, Simone started paying closer attention to the kinds of details most people would overlook, not because she was paranoid, but because she had lived in places where the slightest sound, the faintest shift in someone's gaze could be the first sign of danger. And in Windermere Grove, danger didn't have a face. It nestled itself in the creases of polite behavior. When she was out in the yard clearing fallen leaves, someone walked past. They didn't greet her. They didn't look away either. They stared, an expression free of accusation but devoid of acknowledgement, like she was a smudge on a freshly painted white wall. Not loud, not disruptive, simply not supposed to be there. The house next door had a flag pinned to the fence. The man who lived there, thin, balding, always in a blue shirt with a coffee mug in hand, had never spoken a word to them. But on Monday, as Marcus adjusted the cameras outside, the man called out over the fence without turning around, "As long as those things aren't pointing at my house, we're good." It wasn't overtly rude, but the tone, like Marcus was a trespasser rather than a rightful neighbor, left the air colder. Simone heard it clearly from the kitchen. She didn't go outside. She simply pulled the curtain a bit further to keep the sun from falling directly on her husband's face. A few days later, they received a notice from the HOA. It was a 2-color flyer placed in their mailbox, complete with a logo. But during her afternoon walk, Simone noticed that every other doorstep had an additional slip, a meeting invite with a date and location for next month's HOA gathering. Every house except theirs. She didn't ask about it. She already knew there was no one to ask. That meeting, if it was happening, was never meant for them. On one of her rare walks near the neighborhood's Central Park, Simone came across a boy sitting alone under a large tree. He wore a gray hoodie, had short curls, and held a small plastic toy car in both hands. What caught her attention wasn't his stillness, but his eyes. There was something too heavy, too grown in the gaze of a child who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. As she walked past, the boy looked up. "Are you new here?" he asked, voice so quiet it would have been lost beneath the sound of passing cars. "Yeah, I'm Simone." The boy gave a small nod and looked down again. "I'm Jaden Harris." Simone remembered. The Harris family lived at the end of the street, in the house with the red roof. She'd seen them before. A white couple in their 40s with a dark-skinned boy, often out walking, rarely stopping to chat with anyone else. Jaden looked up again, this time with less hesitation. "You know, I'm the only one here who looks like you. Since I was little, no one around here's ever really liked me." Simone paused. Her heartbeat slowed for a moment. "They don't say that, do they?" Jaden smiled. A crooked, practiced smile, the kind meant to mask more than it revealed. "No, but they do stuff, like pushing my toy out of the sandbox, calling me the brown foster kid. One classmate once said my parents must have glitched the system to end up with me." Simone sat down next to him and said nothing for a while. There was no right comfort in a moment like this. No version of it gets better than felt honest, especially not when a child had learned to see his difference before learning to spell it. I was really happy when you moved in, Jaden continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I was hoping maybe I could be your friend. If someone here looks like me, it doesn't feel so lonely. Simone swallowed. She had fought alongside people willing to die for her, but a child asking to be her friend just because of shared skin, that took the words out of her. Not from surprise, but from a pain so familiar it hurt deeper. She placed her hand gently on Jaden's shoulder. Of course, Jaden. I'm really glad you're here, too. A white SUV passed by, moving slower than it should have. The woman inside glanced through the window, an unspoken, measuring look. Jaden followed her with his eyes, then lowered his head. I'm used to that look, he said. Simone looked too. She recognized it well, had seen it in coffee shops, boardrooms, and battlefields alike. It wasn't openly hostile, but always silently asking, "Do you even belong here?" When Simone returned home, Marcus was standing in the garage, staring at a pile of boxes, still unpacked. He looked up when she walked in, as if about to ask where she'd been, but then he saw her face, and chose not to ask. That night, Simone opened the desk drawer. The anonymous note was still there, folded in half, its edges slightly worn. She pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a formal report. It was a list. Things to do, steps to take, a way to prepare. Because she knew if even a child could feel like he didn't belong, then sooner or later, the adults would act, and next time it might not be silent stares. Ever since that conversation beneath the tree with Jaden, something inside Simone wouldn't settle. The boy's words, the way he looked at her when he asked, "Can I be your friend?" They lingered in her like an underground current, quiet but unrelenting. She'd heard far worse things in her military career, had seen people treated cruelly over the color of their skin, their gender, their background, but nothing compared to the ache of realizing that an 8-year-old child had already learned to endure just to survive in a quiet suburban street. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Simone sat alone on the back steps, holding a cup of cold tea, staring out at the lawn, lost in darkness. She didn't need a light or music, just the space to let her memories return, the way they always did whenever she felt powerless in civilian life. It was during her 7th year in the military. Stationed at a forward outpost in a dangerous region of the Middle East, the attack came without warning. A strike so precise it felt like it had been scripted from the inside. When the first explosion hit, Simone's instinct wasn't to run, it was to calculate. She shouted orders, directed people to cover, identified escape points, and personally dragged 2 wounded soldiers out of the line of fire. 6 hours later, reinforcements arrived. Every single person made it out alive. Not one casualty. 3 days after, she received an invitation to a leadership assessment panel, a major step forward, especially for a black woman in a special operations unit. She prepared thoroughly. Her record was clear, her commendations strong. Even the commanding officer, a man not known for compliments, had told her, "Bennett, you've got the brain of a strategist and the heart of a commander." But the outcome wasn't what she expected. When she entered the meeting room, only 3 people were there. One held her file without bothering to look up. The second smiled, but the kind of smile from someone who's already made up their mind. The third asked her a single question. "Do you think your image can inspire recruits?" Simone didn't understand. She asked for clarification, and the man replied in a flat tone, "Special operations is more than capability. It's about symbolism, role models others can look up to. You're outstanding as an individual, but you might not be the face the military wants on a poster." She didn't argue. She didn't lower her voice. She just felt something cold settle in her chest, like someone had poured a bucket of ice over the fire she'd spent years trying to keep alive. After that, she said nothing, filed no complaints, made no public objections. She simply returned to her quarters, removed her name patch from her chest, and taped a small note to the inside of her locker. It said only one thing: "Be so good They can't ignore you. From that day on, she was the first one on the training field, the last to leave the map room. She learned 2 more languages, upgraded her tactical certifications, and trained for elite survival response. When others went home on leave, she stayed behind to train the next wave. She didn't become the image they wanted. She became the standard they couldn't replace. And little by little, the looks within the unit changed from doubt to respect, from respect to reliance, until one day the very man who had asked about her being inspirational came to her, asking her to lead a rapid response team for an international mission. She said yes, but never forgot the look he gave her in that meeting room, a look filled with bias, carefully dressed in professional language. She took a sip of her cold tea and exhaled slowly. What happened back then no longer made her angry, but it left a scar, deep and permanent, a kind of sharp awakening that stripped her of any illusions about fairness, but never broke her will. Because justice, she had learned, isn't something given. It's something proven by becoming undeniable. Simone stood up and went back inside. Marcus was still asleep, arms wrapped around his pillow like he was holding on to some quiet peace in his dreams. She watched him for a few seconds, then gently pulled the blanket up over his shoulder. On her way out, she paused by the desk. The list she had started was still there. She picked up her pen and added a new item. Make sure Jaden never has to go through what I did. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Because this time, the battlefield wasn't sand and steel. There were no weapons, no trenches. But just like before, she wasn't going to retreat. That morning began like every other in Windmere Grove, the sun rising just enough to cast a soft glow off the stone-paved street, the trees standing perfectly still, and the air carrying that specific kind of silence only affluent neighborhoods are familiar with. Simone stood on the lawn, watering the newly planted rose bushes. The red buds hadn't bloomed yet, still folded tightly in on themselves, as if they too sensed this wasn't a place made for anything fragile. The thin, steady stream of water was less about gardening and more like a quiet gesture of comfort, for the days without greetings, for the eyes watching behind curtains, for Jaden's whispered words that still cut like glass through memory. That peace, however, lasted exactly 15 more seconds. A sharp screech of tires tore through the air, harsh, misaligned, jarring against the artificial rhythm of the neighborhood. A black SUV sped up and braked hard right at the edge of their driveway. Simone immediately looked up. No license plate, tinted windows. No HOA decal, no community markings, and, more telling than any of that, the engine cut off too quickly, like the driver had no intention of this being a brief stop. 2 men stepped out. Both wore dark blue uniforms, the kind labeled civil security, the type Simone had seen hundreds of times. But what she noticed first wasn't the clothing. It was how they moved. The one on the left, tall, pale, moved like someone trained to stand guard but never truly deployed. His steps lacked commitment. His eyes darted in search of control. That was Travis York. The other, shorter, close-cropped hair, hand resting at his waist like he was ready to pull something, revealed a wrist free of any ID badge or comms gear. That was Kyle Reese, the observer, quieter, but his eyes never stopped scanning, tracking the layout as if mapping out the security setup. Simone only needed 3 seconds to decide, not real security, not HOA personnel, not official in any sense. Before she could speak, Travis raised a gun and aimed it straight at her. "You're trespassing on HOA property! Hands up!" Simone didn't move. She kept holding the hose, her fingers tightening just slightly. Her gaze shifted from the muzzle of his gun to his wrist, then to his shoes, the dust on his pant cuffs, the way he leaned left to brace his weight on his right foot. He was used to using force for intimidation, but he hadn't fired a weapon at close range. She'd seen his type before, men in fake uniforms who believed holding a gun made them untouchable. Kyle started drifting toward the porch, eyes scanning as if trying to locate the cameras. Simone kept her eyes locked on Travis. She knew turning her head or backing away would signal vulnerability, but she also knew something else. Travis had made a critical mistake by letting her get this close. Her gaze slid to his belt. No spare mags. Civilian-issue handgun, not a regulated sidearm. His jacket had a loose thread near the collar, like it had been stitched together last minute. The radio clipped to his hip wasn't active. It was a molded dummy for appearance. And most telling of all, no legitimate HOA security would draw a weapon on a decorated military operative at her front yard. Unless he didn't know who she was, or he knew exactly who she was. Simone shifted slightly to her left, just enough to offset the line of fire. Her voice came out low and deliberate, each word sharpened by discipline. You've got 3 seconds to drop the weapon. Then, you're choosing between a charge for armed threat and one for impersonating a public officer. Travis smirked. The smug kind of smirk from someone who thinks he's still in control. Oh, really? What are you going to do, spray me? He said, lifting the gun higher, fingers sliding onto the trigger. Simone didn't answer, but her right foot had already moved half a step back, the perfect range to pivot and disarm. In her mind, there were no questions left, only scenarios. If he fired, she'd shift left, deflect the shot with her elbow, and lock his wrist with a twist at the nerve under his palm. But she didn't move yet. No need. Because she knew her stillness was starting to scare them. Marcus, inside the house, had already begun moving toward the door. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. But his hand resting on the frame told Simone everything. She had backup. Kyle, clearly the support man, began inching toward the vehicle, eyes darting like he was checking for surveillance. Travis still held the gun steady, but if you looked close, his hand was trembling. Simone tilted her head slightly, eyes never leaving his. No force was needed, just a silence strong enough, anchored enough, to make him understand that the next move would decide how this ended. A breeze stirred. One rose petal slipped from its bud and floated down onto the grass like a drop of blood in a peaceful morning. Simone inhaled slowly. The air stretched taut like a cord pulled to its limit, one snap away from chaos. And it was that stillness, not shouting, not force, that made them start to retreat. Not because she threatened them, but because she didn't need to. Travis York still held the gun high, but his finger on the trigger had gone stiff, no longer steady like when he first stepped out of the vehicle. His eyes flicked to Kyle Reese, a silent glance for guidance he no longer had the nerve to voice. There was something in Simone's stare, the stillness, the silence, and, above all, the total absence of fear in the face of a weapon that made him feel like a man who had arrived at the wrong place, faced the wrong person, and picked the wrong fight. Simone didn't blink. She stood firm in the soft morning light, hair tied back without a strand out of place, her hand still holding the now silent hose, her gaze sharp enough to slice through every cheap layer of disguise they wore. Kyle tilted his head toward Travis and muttered, "What are you waiting for? She's alone. Finish it." Travis clenched his jaw, then changed his tone. No more barking orders, just words dripping like acid through his teeth. You know why we're really here? It's not about the damn HOA. It's about people like you, thinking you can squeeze into places that don't belong to you. People like you don't fit in neighborhoods like this. Got it? Kyle let out a harsh laugh, smug and sneering. Isn't it hilarious, watching some black housewife watering roses in $1 million yard like she's living the American dream? Who gave you the right to think you were our neighbor? Simone didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, not in fear, but as if observing a small, pitiful animal that had broken out of its cage, curious to see just how much garbage it would spew before choking on its own ignorance. Her silent contempt was too much for Travis. He snapped. "You think you're something, huh? Who the hell do you think you are?" His eyes barked the next command. Kyle moved immediately, lunging towards Simone with the speed of someone used to relying on brute force to silence discomfort, but he picked the wrong target. Simone shifted lightly to her right, letting the punch sail past. Her arm hooked upward, locking around his elbow, using his momentum to drag him forward. Her knee came up, controlled, not even forceful, but accurate, landing right at his sternum. He doubled over with a dry, shocked grunt. She pivoted her heel a quarter turn, swept her foot behind his ankle, and nudged. His body collapsed onto the lawn like a torn sack of cement, fast, clean, and with no time to cry for help. Travis stepped back. His eyes went wide like he'd just witnessed sorcery. The barrel of his gun still pointed in her direction, but his wrist trembled and sweat slid down his temple to his collar. She's not normal, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Simone straightened, her expression no longer contemptuous, but something harder to swallow: disappointment. Men like Travis and Kyle didn't scare her. They embarrassed her. They were raised in a world that taught them skin color defined worth, that holding a gun gave them permission to disrespect anyone who looked different. And only when they were outmatched by a black woman, smarter, faster, stronger, did they start to realize just how hollow their beliefs were. Travis staggered back another half step, tripping on the edge of the lawn. He stumbled, still holding the gun, but the idea of pulling the trigger had drained from him. Who are you?" he stammered. Simone stepped forward once. The breeze caught the hem of her shirt, lifting it slightly, with the weight of someone who'd faced far worse men than him. "I'm the person you shouldn't judge by her skin," she said quietly, but every syllable hit like steel. Kyle groaned on the ground, clutching his chest, his eyes still wide from the shock, and Travis, though armed, was the one paralyzed. He knew now. He had messed with the wrong woman, and no shadow HO rulebook, no private back channel could save him from the weight of her gaze. Curtains fluttered across the street. Simone noticed. No one yelled, no one called for help, but every window was watching. Every silence was listening, and everyone now understood. The woman they'd dismissed as a harmless housewife had just unmasked an entire underground system with a single, precise act more powerful than words. It wasn't just a takedown, it was a slap in the face to the idea that black people were too uncivil to live in nice neighborhoods, that black women should know their place, that black soldiers should bow in gratitude just for being allowed to live among white picket fences. Travis didn't shoot. He couldn't, because what he saw in front of him wasn't a housewife, and that, more than anything, was what scared him most. Reese was still sprawled across the lawn, groaning in silence, one hand clutching his chest as if trying to hold on to whatever pride hadn't yet crumbled, and Travis York, the same man who had once shouted garbage with a gun pointed at Simone's face, now stood frozen, no longer cocking his weapon, not stepping back, not moving forward. Sweat pooled at his temple, tracing a slow line down the curve of his collar, as if his body had begun to speak the fear his mouth could no longer form. Simone remained upright, her gaze indifferent, her posture unchanged since the moment she struck, like it was just another part of her morning routine. No rage, no panic, only the kind of controlled stillness that men like Travis had never been taught how to confront. But she knew, for people who believed power came from skin color and a loaded gun, the most brutal blow didn't come from fists, it came from a truth they couldn't unwrite. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the flower bed by the porch, where the soil beneath the rosebush looked ever so slightly off, if one knew what to look for. She walked toward it, each step slicing through the tension like a knife through fabric. Travis instinctively raised his gun to follow her movement, but didn't dare speak. Now it was he waiting for her words, not the other way around. She knelt slowly and lifted a precisely cut wooden cupboard disguised as a paving stone. Beneath it lay a steel lockbox, gray and well-used, yet perfectly preserved. No scratches, no rust, the kind of detail only those trained in field intelligence would understand as a sign of top-level preservation. Simone entered the code. 4 digits, not rushed, not hesitant. When the lid popped open, she reached in and pulled out a leather-bound file folder, its edges worn with time. On the cover, embossed in silver, was the emblem of the United States Department of Defense, a silver eagle with wings outstretched, one talon clutching arrows, the other an olive branch, its head turned toward peace, yet its eyes forever reminding that peace comes only after power is proven. She rose to her feet, not bothering to look directly at Travis, and held the folder out not as a threat, but as a statement. Every word he'd spoken now meant nothing. "This is a classified DoD relocation contract," she said, voice low and exact. "This home has been designated under Article 407B of the National Security Redeployment Program. That means anyone without federal clearance has no legal right to step onto this property, let alone point a gun at someone standing on it." Travis didn't move. His face drained of color. His throat twitched. He searched her eyes for any sign this was fake, some bluff he could call, but Simone gave him no exit. "Do you understand?" she continued, her voice never rising. "No HOA supersedes a federal security protocol. No one has the authority to make me leave this home, and no one, especially not you, gets to call me a colored gun wielder when I'm the one assigned to protect the very thing you trample with your privilege." Kyle tried to lift himself again, but his shaking arm gave out, sending him collapsing once more. Travis swallowed hard, his lips pressed shut to hold back what might have been an apology. She needed silence, long enough for him to understand that from this point forward, fear was no longer his currency. Inside, Marcus stood just behind the front door, one hand on the handle, the other holding his phone up, already recording. Simone caught the angle of his camera and, with a barely noticeable nod, confirmed that she had planned for this from the moment the screeching tires broke the morning calm. "You know what I can do with this footage?" she asked, locking eyes with Travis for the first time. "County Police, Department of the Interior, the FBI, every agency can view it and see two impersonators using force to threaten an active duty officer on federal ground. What do you think they'll do with that?" Travis lowered his head, and in that moment, the bravado he wore like armor from the moment he stepped out of that SUV turned to ash. What stood there now was just a man, small, shaking, stripped of the social protection handed to him by white skin, a weapon, and the assumption that the law was his shield. Simone stepped forward and placed the folder on the hood of the black SUV. "Next time," she said, "don't come with a gun, come with the law." A breeze moved through, stirring the scent of wet grass and soil still clinging to the morning. The rose petal that had fallen earlier now rested beneath Kyle's boot, its crimson edge marking the spot of a collapse he'd never forget. And Travis stood still, forced to face the silver eagle of the Department of Defense, something he'd never had the courage to confront before, but now found placed directly in front of him by a black woman, not through violence, but through undeniable truth. The morning breeze still brushed gently across the porch as if nothing had happened, but the front yard was no longer the same. Travis York stood like a statue, the gun in his hand now lowered to his hip, fingers trembling, barely holding on to the very thing he once thought was his invincible shield. And there in the center of it all stood Simone, unshaken, the leather folder with the silver eagle left partly open on the SUV's hood. An unspoken warning that any move made now would be crushed under the weight of proven truth. But she wasn't finished. The final blow wasn't a punch, nor a word. It was the procedure. Simone raised her hand to her collar. A soft click broke the silence as she pressed a nearly invisible mic sewn into the seam of her shirt. Her voice was calm, clear, and slow. "Bravo 9 to Sentinel," confirming the presence of two armed impersonators threatening federal personnel on classified property, requesting immediate support and the image verification team. Travis flinched. The code names, the military cadence, snapped him out of his illusion of control. That tiny mic, which moments ago he dismissed as a Bluetooth earpiece, now revealed something he hadn't accounted for. The woman standing before him wasn't alone. She was connected to something much bigger, something far beyond the reach of any HOA. Marcus stepped fully onto the porch, holding his phone up at shoulder height, camera fixed on Travis. His voice was steady, but sharp as a blade. "Say hi to the sheriff." Travis paled. His gun hand dropped completely. His knees bent slightly, as if seeking something to lean on. But Simone wasn't going to let him slip away in silence. She pressed the mic again. "Sentinel, confirm escalation. Armed impersonation, potential resistance. Priority level 2. Windmere Grove, address 143. Kyle, still on the ground, croaked out, Who Who did you call? HOA security doesn't take orders from that. Simone turned to him, not to argue, just to clarify with precision. That's because you're not secure. You're pretending. You thought a uniform and a gun could replace the law. But law doesn't come from what you wear, it comes from what backs it. And today, you stepped into territory where pretending gets you prosecuted. Marcus tilted his phone, letting Travis see the live feed from their front security camera. Everything from the moment the SUV screeched to a halt, to them stepping out, drawing their weapons, spitting insults, it was all there. At the bottom of the screen, bold text read, Live-scared plus DOJ secure feed. We were just following orders from the board, Travis stammered, sweat streaking down his face. Orders? Simone's voice dropped in temperature. Whose orders? Who signed off on it? Who sent you? What authority does the HOA have to send armed men to the home of a federally protected officer? Travis didn't answer. He knew. Any name he gave would be logged, and if it was false, he'd be obstructing an investigation. If true, he'd expose his handlers. He was trapped. Every second that passed, Simone's gaze pressed harder, forcing him to lower his eyes, not in fear of her strength, but of her Sentinel confirms Bravo 9 signal. Video received. Response unit en route. ETA 3 minutes. Maintain the scene, came the voice through the mic, female, emotionless, absolute. Simone didn't speak again. She stepped back, putting space between herself and Travis, not to retreat, but to make room for justice to arrive and do what needed to be done. A siren wailed in the distance, still far but closing fast. Red and blue lights flickered in the windows of nearby houses, bouncing off glass like a quiet alarm bell. Travis's eyes filled with dread. Kyle dragged himself toward the SUV, but no longer had the strength to pull the door open. Simone turned to Marcus, her voice soft. Save the stream in 3 places. Cloud, hard drive, and send it to the lawyer. Marcus nodded. His hands didn't shake. He knew this was the moment of no return, but they'd been ready for it for a long time. She stood there, on the dew-covered grass, roses still unopened, but her mind at ease. There was nothing left to say. The police were coming, the system would take over, and the 2 men who thought a fake badge was all they needed were about to learn what it meant to threaten someone protected not by noise, but by law. With one tap on a mic, she had triggered what they never saw coming. A chain reaction of justice, set off by the very woman they once dismissed with a glance. The first sound sliced through the silence like a crack across glass, the wail of approaching sirens, sharp and clear, reverberating off rooftops and slipping through every window in Windmere Grove. For a moment, the entire neighborhood held its breath. No one spoke, no one moved, just the siren, getting closer, dragging red and blue lights across pristine white walls like a slow peel, exposing what everyone knew but had refused to admit. Travis York staggered back, the trembling hand holding his gun, finally letting it slip. The metal hit the grass with a dry, lifeless clank, not cinematic, just real and empty. Kyle Reese, still gripping the SUV's side for balance, let go and slumped down beside the tire, as if lowering his head deep enough might make the world forget he was there. 2 minutes later, the special response unit and local police arrived. Without shouting, without fuss, just with a kind of swift precision that said everything. Uniformed officers moved with practiced urgency, ignoring bystanders, brushing past anything irrelevant. One officer walked straight to Simone, offering a nod like one professional to another. Another restrained Travis without a word, snapping on cuffs. Kyle didn't even struggle as he was pressed into the damp grass. And Simone remained still, calm, like she was watching a familiar procedure unfold exactly as it should. Marcus stepped off the porch, phone still recording, his expression neither proud nor triumphant, just quietly serious, as if he too was watching to confirm that, this time, justice had arrived. Then came a voice, small, breaking the air like a pebble dropped into a heavy lake. Don't hurt her. It wasn't an adult. It wasn't a cop. It was a child. And every head turned. A tiny figure pushed through the forming police barrier, sprinting across the lawn. Small legs fought the grass. Curly hair bounced wildly from running too fast. He clutched a toy police car in one hand. Jaden Harris, the only black child in the neighborhood, the only one who had dared to speak honestly with Simone, and the only one who no longer trusted shiny badges to mean what they said. "She's good. She's a good person," he shouted. His voice cracked with tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. An officer stepped in to block him, but Simone spoke first. "Let him come." Jaden flung himself into her arms, clutching tight like she was the only steady thing in a world unraveling. His small body trembled. I thought they were here to take you," he whispered. Simone knelt, wrapped him close, and gently smoothed his trembling hair. "No, Jaden, I'm okay. They're here to do the right thing. This time, it's the right thing." Jaden didn't let go. He leaned in close, barely audible. "They did this to my friend's dad once. They had guns too. They yelled the same way." No one said anything. Not the officers, not the neighbors, because that voice, from a child, had just spent years pretending not to hear. Curtains stirred inside nearby homes. A door creaked open. Eyes peered from a second-story balcony. Everyone had seen. Everyone had heard. But none had acted, until a child did. And something broke, not with sound, but with recognition, as if Windmere Grove had suddenly realized silence isn't neutrality, it's a side. And this morning they had picked the wrong one. Marcus slowly turned his phone, capturing it all. Jaden in Simone's arms, the officers standing guard, Travis and Kyle cuffed on the lawn. No subtitles needed, no explanation. The image said it all, a truth too visible to ignore. When a child understands justice better than an entire neighborhood. Simone rose, still holding Jaden's hand. She didn't have to speak to anyone, but her eyes scanned the half-open windows, the shyly parting curtains, and that look was a question no one dared answer. How much longer will you pretend not to see? How many more voices need to rise before you finally speak? In a country that once wrote a constitution to protect liberty, there are still neighborhoods where freedom is hidden under layers of white paint and the hush of timed sprinklers. In a nation built on equality, there are still places where a brown-skinned child learns to fear a police siren before he learns his ABCs. Jaden knew nothing about politics, but he knew who was good, and he acted with the kind of courage that only comes from a heart still untainted by prejudice. As police led Travis and Kyle away, Simone knelt and tucked the toy police car into Jaden's hand. "Next time you play with this," she said, "imagine it's coming to protect someone like you, then make that real." Jaden nodded. No more tears. A child had shattered the silence of adults, and in that moment an entire neighborhood was forced to wake up, not by gunfire, but by one small voice saying what none of them could. "Don't hurt her. She's good." The morning that should have marked the end of all tension brought no calm to Windmere Grove. There were no apologies at Simone's door. No neighbors stepped across the lawn to ask, "Are you okay?" The silence that followed the climax carried no peace, only a heavier, colder pause thick with meaning. Simone could feel the undercurrents shift beneath the manicured grass, the masks slowly being lowered, not with words, but with glances. No one shouted at her, no one openly opposed her, but the neighbors' gates now close earlier. Evening walks by couples suddenly took shorter routes that no longer passed her fence. The HOA's monthly gathering was abruptly made invite-only, and when Marcus stepped into the town central coffee shop, the owner, once all smiles, simply said, "To go only, no seats left." No one had to say it aloud. They all acted as if Simone's family were the disruptors, as if she, not the two armed impersonators, had somehow posed the real threat to their orderly, proper neighborhood. Marcus didn't speak much about it, but Simone noticed. Every time he returned from outside, he checked the door camera, inspected the mail before opening it. She understood. The man who once held his ground on active battlefields was now relearning how to navigate a quieter kind of threat, one he couldn't shoot or out-strategize. A week after the incident, Simone stood in the kitchen making tea when Marcus walked in from the porch. In his hand was a white envelope, unlabeled, unsealed, made of thick administrative-grade paper. He said nothing, just placed it on the table, his expression unreadable. Simone opened it. One sentence, bold in black ink. "You're not done. You can't win." No signature. But Simone knew the language well, the cold syntax of veiled threats. She folded the letter, set it down, and exhaled deeply. "They know," she said. "This wasn't random. What happened last week was only the first move." Marcus sat across from her. "Frand. Albert Frand? Okay. I thought so. The moment they showed up, the uniforms were off, the weapons weren't registered, the way they moved. It wasn't about intimidation, it was trained, it was a test." "A test?" Simone asked, though she already knew. "To see how you'd react? Would you resist, use force, call in backup?" They weren't here to win, they were here to record. In that moment, both understood. What they'd faced wasn't an isolated incident nor the act of two rogue bigots. It was a coordinated probe, with intent and a directive from someone higher. Simone walked to her desk drawer and pulled out a small USB drive. She had archived the footage from the front gate camera, the lawn feed, and Marcus's live recording. She plugged it into her laptop. One by one, the images loaded. The SUV's arrival, Travis stepping out, drawing his gun, Jaden running into her arms and shouting for the world to hear. But even the clearest footage meant nothing if no one was forced to watch. Whoever was behind Travis and Kyle, if they truly existed, would not be easy to expose. Because in a system like America's, where discrimination is cloaked in phrases like community standards and cultural integrity, the most dangerous men don't carry guns, they wear tailored suits. They don't shout hate, they write it into HOA bylaws. Simone paused the footage at a single frame. Travis frozen mid-threat, gun raised, eyes uncertain. Kyle was on the ground, one hand pressed into the turf. Behind them, clean roofs, trimmed lawns, half-drawn curtains. A perfect 21st century suburban postcard. She looked at Marcus. "We're no longer playing defense." He nodded. She continued. "This is tactical, an opening move, and if they think we won't push back, they'll keep coming. More subtle but more dangerous." She took the envelope, walked into the backyard. Beneath the maple tree, she lit each edge of the letter with a lighter. The paper curled inward, burning slowly before disintegrating into black ash in her open palm. She let the wind take it, not out of fear, but because she had already kept what mattered. Confirmation that this was a war. But unlike past wars, she wasn't in uniform this time. She wore a collared shirt, flat shoes, drank morning tea, and tended roses, and precisely because of that, they would never see her coming. They hadn't just picked the wrong person. They'd picked the one woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to be legitimate. One early morning, with the sky veiled in a sheer layer of mist like stretched white silk, Simone drove out of Windmere Grove alone. Marcus didn't come. Not because she was hiding anything from him, but because some meetings are meant to happen in silence, between people who understand each other not through words, but through the scars behind their eyes. She didn't head toward the town center. Instead, she drove 12 minutes north, to a small diner tucked beside an old gas station, where the wood sign was peeling and the menu board still used plastic letters instead of a screen. In places like this, important information didn't live in databases. It flowed through black coffee and short, quiet handshakes. Sitting in the far corner was Gabriel Shaw, once a special intelligence officer, now an independent analyst, no suit, no watch. But every movement was precise, deliberate, like even the tapping of his fingers had purpose. When Simone walked in, Gabriel gave a small nod instead of a greeting and slid a brown envelope across the table. "You sure you want to see it all?" he asked. Half concerned, half knowing. Simone didn't answer. She opened the envelope. Inside was a thick stack of documents, not arranged like bureaucratic reports, but mapped out with the logic of someone tracking covert networks. Wire transfers linked to surnames matching HOA members. the names of real estate developers behind model communities, simplified tax records, contracts for private security with loopholes excluding judicial oversight, and most damning, a compiled list of families who had moved out within 6 months of arrival. 89% were Black or Latin. Of those, 62% were military, either active duty or retired. Many hadn't even sold their homes, but had urgently transferred ownership under legal pressure, HOA fines, administrative citations, or simply the weight of being stared at until they couldn't breathe. Gabriel spoke slowly, like explaining something he wished wasn't true. Simone, this isn't isolated anymore. This is a system. HO's just the storefront. Behind it are real estate firms, satellite companies, even investment funds that use civil codes to screen residents by skin color, by background, even by voice pattern. Simone flipped to the last page. A watermark caught her eye. A small line of text that stopped her cold. Cultural cohesion preservation. Maintaining traditional neighborhood identity. No definition attached. None needed. Everyone knew what traditional meant. And who did it exclude? She looked up. Is this why they sent Travis and Kyle? Gabriel nodded. No doubt. You weren't the first target, just the first to respond the right way. Simone leaned back, palm flat against the dossier, her hand cold. Part of her had suspected, but seeing racism systemized under the name of community management hit harder than any ambush. She'd once sat in Pentagon briefing rooms, discussing global threats, terrorism, and psychological warfare. No one had told her the most dangerous front line might be a cul-de-sac lined with white fences, trimmed lawns, and streets named after British poets. Gabriel studied her face, then asked quietly, "Why'd you choose to live there?" Simone pressed her lips together, almost a smile. "Because I thought if I was qualified enough, disciplined enough, if I arrived under federal policy, they'd accept me. And now I know. There's no version of me white enough to make them comfortable." The diner fell silent. Just the clink of a spoon in a ceramic cup, the soft hum of a ceiling fan, and a sharp ache behind Simone's ribs, where she kept the quiet truth. The America she'd sworn to defend with her life might not be ready to welcome her home as a citizen. She closed the folder and met Gabriel's eyes. "I don't need sympathy. I need names, I need proof, I need to know who signed, who approved, and who moved the money." He nodded. "It's all there. And some of the names, they're not just local. Some of them sit on the city council. A few work in federal zoning boards." Simone exhaled. "Then this isn't just about protecting my house, it's about cutting this thing out at the root." Gabriel handed her a USB. "This holds internal emails between HOA boards across 4 counties. Some of it'll chill your spine. But it's enough to make them show their faces, if you know how to use it." Simone stared at the small device in her hand. She knew this wasn't about her anymore. Not about protecting Jaden, not even about defending her home. It was about unmasking a machine powered by privilege, dressed in kindness, and if they thought she would stay quiet, bow her head, or quietly pack up like those before her, then they'd made a mistake this system couldn't recover from. They underestimated a Black woman trained to survive every kind of war. That night, Simone sat alone in her home office. The laptop screen glowed faintly, casting a soft blue sheen across her cheek, like moonlight shimmering over still water. She flipped through the dossier Gabriel Shaw had left. Name after name, address, bank account, transfer dates, everything laid out with clinical precision. No wasted details, no sentimental footnotes. But on page 37, she stopped. A name printed in the same font, same ink as the rest, but the tightness in her chest told a different story. David Mercer, Edgewater Heights, Deputy Executive Director at Silver Shield Solutions, a private security firm that provided personnel to residential HOA contracts across the region. The man who authorized the deployment of a special inspection team to Windmere Grove last week. The man who wired payment to Travis York. The man who once served beside her in a joint strategic unit in Syria. And the man whose life she had once saved in a war zone. The memories came without warning. the way only combat memory does. Images not in order but in fragments. Gunfire to the west, choking smoke across a broken town, David crawling with a leg wound behind a crumbled wall, hand bloodied, gripping a pistol. She remembered the moment she turned back, crossed open terrain, under fire, laid suppressing cover and dragged him across a debris-strewn trench. A bullet tore past her face and sliced her headset, but she didn't stop. That night, the unit made it out. David was the last one on the helicopter. Because she got him there. They'd once shared instant coffee on an ammo crate, talked about what came after. David said he wanted to do something for the community. She had laughed. Just getting home would be enough of a miracle. She never thought the man who owed her his life would one day sign off on sending armed impersonators to her doorstep, not because she couldn't imagine he'd change, but because she never imagined he could look away so easily. She closed the folder slowly, not in anger, not with violence, just the slow, heavy motion of something breaking quietly. She didn't cry, she never had, but something deeper moved inside her. The slow burning realization that when trust is torn by someone who once held your life in his hands, it doesn't leave a wound, it leaves doubt. Doubt about whether anything you gave was ever enough to be seen as one of them. Marcus walked in. He saw her face, stone still, but her eyes told him she was excavating something deeper. "Who is it?" he asked, barely above a whisper. She handed him the file. He scanned it, stopped at the name. "That's him? The one you pulled out of the rubble?" She nodded. He wanted to say something, but didn't. What words could hold a betrayal like this? Not from an enemy, but from someone who once shared the same uniform. Simone spoke once, quietly. "I'm not angry. I don't have time to be." And Marcus understood that kind of calm is worse than rage, because it means the heart has already moved past hope. That justice to her now wasn't about gratitude or loyalty. It was about structure, about systems. She stood, folder in hand, and walked to her desk. The USB from Gabriel lay waiting, full of HOA communications across counties. She would trace it all, but of all the enemies she was about to expose, none chilled her like David Mercer. Simone could endure racism from strangers. She could fight back when targeted for being black, a woman, and a soldier, but she never expected someone she once saved to stay silent when others came to harm her. She sat down, opened a new folder on her laptop, and typed, "Mercer, the betrayal file." Some wars don't start with gunfire. They begin the moment someone who once stood beside you says nothing while others aim. And that silence, that's the first shot fired. Nights in Windmere Grove were usually quiet enough to hear the drip of water from a roof gutter, the rustle of dry leaves hitting the stone path, and sometimes the distant echo of a siren, thin and faint, like a whispered reminder that outside the whitewashed illusion, the world was still burning, still bleeding, still fighting battles that this place pretended didn't exist. But for Simone, that night was anything but quiet. On her screen was the portrait of a man, silver hair slicked neatly back, pale gray eyes looking not at the camera but slightly off, as if still weighing whether to appear polite or contemptuous. Alec Monroe, chairman of Monroe Holdings, a silent financier behind over a dozen upscale residential communities, owner of multiple nameless shell companies, and the final name in the chain of shady wire transfers linking anonymous accounts to the HOA that tried to trap her family. It had taken Gabriel 3 days to follow the trail. Layered shell registrations, virtual office addresses, encrypted email chains. They all led to one name. Alec didn't hide. He didn't have to, because real power, Simone had come to understand, didn't come from secrecy. It came from existing in plain sight and knowing no one dared touch you. But this time, Gabriel brought more than a name. He brought a sealed past, pulled from internal military archives. Alec Monroe had once served in the Air Force, holding the rank of captain, projected to rise quickly due to leadership skill and deep-rooted connection, but it ended within a month of a base incident. No casualties, no violence, just a leaked audio file. Monroe, drunk, unleashing a string of racial slurs at black service members. One line stood out. No reason to put a monkey with a gun in formation with men. The recording had spread quickly through the ranks. Alec was asked to take early retirement. His honors stayed intact, but his military future died that day. Then he disappeared, until Monroe holdings surfaced and Alec emerged as the man pulling strings behind real estate and enforcement. Simone sat still, eyes fixed on the screen. She wasn't afraid, but she saw something else. Strategic silence. Alec didn't have to do much. The system had already been built for him, a system where bias didn't have to scream, it just had to be renamed. Culture, standards, community harmony. She reread one of Alec's internal speeches from a real estate summit. We're not against anyone, we're simply preserving what makes neighborhoods like Windermere symbolic. Order, tradition, a shared set of values. And Simone knew, within Alec's gaze, she was the fracture in the picture he was desperate to restore. A black woman, former special forces, living in a sea of white picket fences, not bowing, not silenced, and worst of all, still standing after the first blow. She opened the surveillance footage again. Every step Travis and Kyle had taken was deliberate. They didn't act on impulse. They scoped the camera angles, they waited until Marcus was out of sight. They never mentioned who sent them, but every motion followed tactical rhythm, movements only someone with military familiarity could design. She looked at another photo, Alec Monroe in uniform, taken before his forced discharge. Those same gray eyes had once looked toward her during a joint drill. She hadn't remembered him, but clearly he remembered her, and Simone understood this wasn't a business play. This was revenge, carefully orchestrated. Alec had been exiled from an institution he believed had been tainted, diluted by racial preferences. Now, he was rebuilding his military through HOS, through men like Travis and Kyle, through bylaws banning large dogs, unapproved landscaping, and etic disruptions to neighborhood uniformity. One hand drew the map, the other issued orders. And the victims? Families like hers, children like Jaden, veterans with no safe place to settle, and worse, a whole community being moved out, inch by inch, without realizing they were standing inside a private resegregation experiment built by an old soldier with a grudge. Simone shut off the screen. There was no fire in her chest, no boiling anger, only stillness, stone cold, steady, because this time, she wouldn't just bring down a man, she would pull the foundation out from under his feet, brick by brick, until the whole structure collapsed quietly, but without mercy. Alec Monroe had believed he could rebuild the world in his image, but he'd forgotten one thing. People like Simone didn't come to fit into systems. They came to test whether those systems deserved to exist at all. That night, the wind cut across the northern hills of the city, carrying a chill from the river that felt more like a warning than weather. From a distance, Alec Monroe's estate looked like a fortress, 2-meter-high fences wrapped around the perimeter, security lights mounted on every corner, and an iron gate embedded with face recognition cameras masked behind polished stone. To outsiders, it was a symbol of power. To Simone, it was a carefully crafted shell built to hide a ghost. She and Marcus moved along a narrow path behind the tree line near the estate's wall. Gabriel, parked a block away in a surveillance van, monitored the feed he had spliced into the estate's system 2 days earlier through frequency jamming injection. No sirens, no breach team, just the silent infiltration of 2 people trained to survive. Simone pulled on gloves, gently brushed back the foliage, then slipped through a pre-cut gap in the fence. Marcus followed, precise as always, but this time his eyes weren't just those of a husband. They were the eyes of a teammate who knew when to take the lead, when to follow. Inside, the lighting was uneven. A few rooms remained lit, mostly on the ground floor, including Alec's private office. They didn't have to search long. Yelling cracked through the glass door to the left, as clear as a trail of breadcrumbs left by a man too confident to keep his voice down. She was supposed to be scared and leave. Alec's voice rang out, dry but unmistakably panicked. You said just one push. One. What the hell happened? Kyle's voice stumbled in, broken and nervous. I didn't know she was legit. I thought she was ex-military. She had a mic, a camera, a support unit. Simone paused, pressed herself flat against the wall. Marcus reached into his jacket, pulled out a pocket recorder, and hit play. The audio was fed in clean, no more than 3 meters from the source. Inside the room, Alec hissed, his words grinding out like they'd been shredded from somewhere deep. She's not just a problem. She's a goddamn catastrophe. Everything I built, order, uniformity, control, it all unravels if people of color think they can live as equals here. A pause followed, as if even he realized he'd gone too far. But then, with the smug, venomous ease of a man too used to being untouchable, Alec continued, We gave them chances, they didn't take them. So now we do it differently. Devalue the property, ramp up citations, hit them with surprise audits, rezone the sidewalks if we have to. No one lasts here if they don't match the identity. Simone stood in the shadows. She didn't breathe hard, didn't flinch, but inside her, every word Alex spoke sliced through memories like glass. Black soldiers she once served with, single mothers denied rental applications for not fitting the community, children like Jaden learning to stay silent on school playgrounds. This wasn't a system glitch. This wasn't individual bias. This was deliberate. This was doctrine. This was social cleansing disguised as an investment strategy. Alec kept speaking, his tone lower now but no less poisonous. We don't need camps. We have HOA regulations. We don't need color lines. We've got architectural clauses, and we don't have to say no blacks allowed. We just say, doesn't meet community standards. The paperwork does the rest. As his final sentence landed, a soft beep sounded. Marcus had stopped recording, and that was the moment Simone stepped out from the shadows. Alec froze. Kyle recoiled, face drained of blood. Simone stood tall, gloves still on, hair tied tight, and eyes brighter than any light in the room. She didn't yell. She didn't draw a weapon. She didn't need fists. Just one sentence. Because you had no idea who you were dealing with. Alex stumbled back, bumping against the edge of the desk. Simone advanced, slow, steady, unshakable. You thought you could predict every reaction. You built an entire system to erase people like me, but you never realized some of us were trained to see systems like yours before they're even fully formed. Alec opened his mouth, ready to protest, threaten, or insult, but no words came out. Simone leaned forward, placing a hard-copy dossier on the desk, the Department of Justice seal stamped clearly at the top. The papers were creased, stapled, and every page was a piece of evidence. Audio, images, financial transactions, and the recording he'd just handed her himself. You don't need to say anything else, she said, voice calm like closing arguments in a courtroom that already had a verdict. Your story ends here. Outside, the wind howled against the glass. But this time, it wasn't wind from the hills. It was the arrival of a storm, and Alec Monroe, with everything he believed to be untouchable, had chosen the wrong woman to start this war with. The crunch of tires on stone outside the Monroe estate sounded like the drumbeat of justice striking right on time, sharp, cold, and offering no room for escape. The wrought iron gate, once reserved for facial recognition entry, was torn open at one side, its hinges shrieking in protest as black-gloved hands pushed it wide. Armored vehicles rolled in one after another, not stamped with any HOA insignia, but bearing the unmistakable gold letters of the United States Department of Justice, DOJ, moving like a convoy of reckoning that had waited far too long for this moment. Behind them came state police cruisers, real law enforcement, not outsourced private security, carrying real authority, real badges, and legitimacy that no amount of HOA paperwork could outmatch. At the rear, a plain black SUV rolled in, silent, unmarked. Except for the investigative journalist riding shotgun, the one Simone had quietly tipped off ahead of time, the same woman who once took down 3 city council members with a single, well-timed exposé. They flooded in like a storm. Alec Monroe couldn't stop with money or bylaws. Simone remained still inside his office, untouched, gloved hands at her sides, not needing to turn, not needing to speak. She looked only at Alec, the man who just minutes earlier had been roaring racial venom, now frozen in place, as if the weight of reality had begun to calcify him from the inside out. The thud of boots on hard wood echoed like a countdown. A DOJ tactical officer entered first, eyes scanning the room. One glance at Marcus, still holding the recorder in his palm, and the officer gave a silent signal. No reading of rights. No shouts of, "You're under arrest." They simply moved in, slipped behind Alec, who could barely keep himself upright, and locked their arms behind him with trained efficiency. Click. The sound of the cuffs was a verdict in itself, short, final, and exactly what the world watching had been waiting to hear. Alec stiffened, shoulders tight, not from pain but from shame. He turned back, eyes bloodshot, but found no one to blame. No HOA to hide behind, no civil task force to order around. Every mask, from flowery rhetoric to weaponized municipal codes, had been stripped away by a recording and the very woman he once dismissed as an outsider. Another officer stepped forward, reciting the charges: impersonating federal agents, organizing illegal civil enforcement units with the intent to discriminate, committing real estate fraud through coercive contract structures, armed intimidation of a federally protected individual, obstructing justice during an active federal investigation. Each count read out was a hammer strike against the illusion of power Alec had curated over the last decade, and when the list ended, he said nothing. Not because he lacked words, but because, for the first time in his life, he was in a world where he didn't write the rules. Outside, camera flashes began to strobe. The broken gate allowed the entire media caravan to roll into the driveway. Lenses turned toward the mansion that had once been his control center, a shadow empire run from behind clipped hedges and manicured silence. But now, that very home had become a crime scene, and his empire had been dragged into daylight. Simone stepped out onto the porch, shoulders square, eyes forward, unflinching under the gaze of 100 lenses. No one accused her, no one questioned her, no one turned away. Because she hadn't come to start a war, she had come to end one that had been burning for far too long, beneath the illusion of perfect lawns and ornamental gates. A journalist approached. Mic extended. "Ms. Bennett, how do you feel at this moment?" Simone watched as the vehicle carrying Alec disappeared beyond the tree line. She didn't smile. She wasn't angry. She simply answered quietly, "This isn't a victory. This is justice and truth." A short sentence on the surface, but it sliced silently through the polished facade of Windmere Grove like a blade, cutting through the quiet complicity that had for so long passed as order, through the silence worn as safety, and through the willful blindness mistaken for peace. No one replied to Simone. There was no applause, no praise, not even an apology. But in the bowed heads of those who had once held themselves upright with pride, there was something heavier, an unspoken admission they had been wrong. Wrong to stay silent in the face of injustice. Wrong for letting prejudice stand in place of principle. And most of all, wrong for believing they could remain untouched as long as they kept their eyes shut to the truth. Behind the white-painted fence that had once marked the invisible boundary between us and them, Jaden Harris stood motionless, his hand clutched tightly in the hand of his adoptive mother, a white woman who had chosen to raise him, knowing full well the looks from neighbors would never fully soften. Jaden's face was lifted, his eyes wide, not in surprise, but because for the first time he had seen someone who looked like him rise and be heard, not silenced, not dismissed, not forced to choose between truth and survival. Simone saw him, and her gaze met something in his that mirrored a piece of her childhood. The stares on the school bus, the question, Where are you really from? The doors that never needed a reason to close. But she was no longer the child denied a seat at the table. She was now the woman who stood unflinching in front of a system designed to bury her and made it lower its eyes instead. Her smile was small, not of triumph, not of satisfaction, but just enough to say, "You saw it, didn't you, Jaden? Truth has a place to stand, and justice even late will come, if we hold the fire long enough for it." She hadn't needed Alec to be arrested to feel peace. She didn't need handcuffs or headlines to know she was right. Because her victory had never been about taking down a man. It was about puncturing a machine built so seamlessly, so quietly, that no one ever thought to question it. Victory was when a black child could grow up never asking whether his skin made him worth less. When a mother no longer had to teach her son to swallow rage just to survive. When a black family didn't have to assimilate to be accepted, but was allowed to simply exist and be enough. And Simone knew that didn't come from force, not from status or money or access. It came from legitimacy, the rare kind of power no one can grant you. It can only be earned through action, through choice, and through the refusal to back down in front of things designed not to move. Because while she alone might not dismantle the whole system, she had done something far greater. She had made the system look at itself. And in that instant, when every eye that once avoided had to face the truth, it was already too late for the masks. Real power, Simone had learned, never lies in how many people you can control. It lies in how many are willing to say no, even when they know the cost. It doesn't come from badges, access passes, or luxury cars parked in pristine driveways. It comes from the courage that stays whole even after 100 quiet exclusions. And if Simone leaves anything behind, it won't be glory, it will be a belief that anyone, no matter how small, how outcast, can be the start of a rupture in a rotting machine of discrimination, as long as they don't bow, don't stay silent, and don't fall. That morning, the sun didn't blaze, but it was bright enough to catch the thin trails of dust floating in Simone's kitchen. On the table, next to a cup of coffee still steaming, sat a white envelope, folded carefully, no return name, just one line of handwritten blue ink. For Miss Simone Bennett. No postmark. Someone had likely placed it in the mailbox by hand, quietly, without fanfare, just like the life Simone had stepped into, where the most necessary voices were often buried under the thick silence of fear. She opened the letter, and with just the first line, her fingers paused, trembling slightly. "Because of you, my son slept through the night for the first time in 3 months." Below that, a second line, blunt, honest, unadorned. "He doesn't dream of guns anymore." The rest of the letter wasn't long, but every word felt like it had been written with the heart of a mother who had endured too much helplessness, who had spent too many nights holding her child through sobs she couldn't soothe. She wrote about infertility, about how Jaden came into their lives not as a second-best choice, but as a miracle they never believed they'd be given. From the first day they brought him home, they vowed to protect him, to love him as their own, and they did. With every tender act, homemade breakfasts, long hugs after school when Jaden came home quiet for reasons he couldn't explain. But Windmere Grove wasn't what they'd imagined. Whispers behind their backs. Eyes were deliberately averted when Jaden played in the yard. And worst of all, the other children had begun to use his skin as a joke. One asked if Jaden was adopted because he didn't look like anyone around here. Another snatched a toy police car from him and said, "Black kids don't become cops. They get arrested by them." Each word was a wound you couldn't see, but bled night after night. Jaden began to dream of sirens and shadows. One night he screamed in the dark, telling his mother, "I hear the sirens coming, but I don't know where to hide." All she could do was hold him, whispering, "It's okay, I'm here," though even she didn't know if her words could hold the world at bay. And then Simone moved in. No grand announcements, no explanations. But her presence did what 1,000 reassurances couldn't. It made space for the possibility that blackness didn't have to exist only in silence, in survival, in apology. When Jayden saw Simone standing in her garden, tall and unbent beneath the weight of a neighborhood's gaze, he saw something no one had ever taught him, that he was not a mistake inside America's dream. The letter said that after the day Simone stood her ground with the DOJ behind her, after Alec was cuffed and taken away in full view of the houses that had pretended not to see, Jayden slept, deeply, without flinching. The next morning he said something that made his mother cry. "Mom, I dreamed I wore a uniform, like hers, but I didn't get shot. I got saluted." Simone stopped reading there, not to pause, but because something in her chest had quieted. She had survived kill zones, held dying brothers in her arms, dragged bodies out of burning wrecks, but never had her existence felt more undeniable than in that moment, when she realized a single act of being visible had taught a child to dream forward instead of flinch backward. The mother ended her letter with words not dramatic but resolute. "I won't pretend I've been brave, but because of you, I now know that courage starts when you stare fear down and don't let it speak louder than love. I've never said this to anyone in our neighborhood, but today I'll say it to you. Thank you for staying, for Jayden, and for all the other children who no longer sleep in nightmares." Simone folded the letter slowly, her hand resting on the crease as if trying to hold on to the warmth still hiding in the dried ink. She didn't need applause. She didn't need to be called a hero. But in that moment, she understood something no drill sergeant had ever taught her, that the most vital war wasn't on the battlefield. It was in helping a child believe they had the right to dream in a country that once refused to offer that dream to anyone who looked like them. And for her, that was enough, not to finish, but to continue. Because there were still too many Jaydens out there, still afraid. But if every community had even one person who dared to stand up, who dared to stay, then one day there would be no nightmares left to hide in. The courtroom that Monday morning was nothing like the movies. No dramatic gavels, no weeping monologues, just the soft rustle of papers being turned, the steady scratch of a clerk's pen, and a heavy stillness hanging in the air like rain pressing on a darkening sky. Simone sat in the witness gallery, spine straight, shoulders relaxed but gaze sharp. She wasn't in uniform nor dressed to impress, just a pale gray shirt beneath a sand-colored jacket, as if even her clothing refused to be the center of attention. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to make the system see itself. On the defendant's bench stood Alec Monroe, flanked by two attorneys, his face no longer holding the smugness it wore the day he was cuffed outside his estate. His hair was neatly combed, his suit pressed, but his every movement bore the weight of someone who now understood that power no longer protected him. It was now the substance of the charges about to be named. Beneath the fabric of his appearance was a collapsing network, a structure he'd built through bylaws, affluence, and prejudice masked as order. As the hearing progressed, the room thickened. Names were called: HOA board members from other communities, executives from shell companies labeled as community management, financial officers from Monroe Holdings, all cited in internal reports, exposed through subpoenaed emails and sworn testimony. Then came the name David Mercer. When the court clerk read the formal charges, his approval of contracts used to hire private forces that targeted black families under the guise of community order, Simone didn't bow her head. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him. And David, the man whose life she once saved under enemy fire, looked away, as though the pane of glass between them could erase the weight of that memory. He didn't beg, but in his eyes was remorse, the kind that doesn't need words. A man who had once been carried off a battlefield by Simone now found himself brought down not by bullets, but by the very justice he once helped avoid. When the sentence came, probation, removal from leadership, a permanent ban from working in any civic institution, Simone didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. because that verdict wasn't just a loss of title. It was the quiet dismantling of a man who had forgotten the meaning of being saved. When her turn came to speak, many expected Simone to demand harsh punishment, a call to avenge the insults, the danger, the betrayal. But she walked calmly to the stand, opened her folder, and spoke in a tone as steady as running water. "I'm not here to ask for longer prison sentences," she said, "because I don't believe change begins at the bottom of a cell. It begins with understanding how people like him were allowed to rise to the top." The room didn't move. She continued, "I'm submitting a formal petition to the Department of the Interior to establish a statewide task force to audit and investigate HOS. It must be independently governed, transparent, and immune to local civic influence. No one should have the power to write rules that erase people from where they live, especially when those rules are rooted in fear and reinforced by silence." She didn't stop there. Simone presented a structural plan for oversight, 3 tiers: direct community reporting, anonymous complaint platforms, and review boards that included legal experts, sociologists, and minority voices. No one, she said, should be exiled just for being born into a body that didn't match someone else's comfort. In the front row, a silver-haired official from the department nodded. Not dramatically, but with the kind of gravity that signals an idea had landed where it needed to. Someone, at last, was ready to start tearing down the polite walls built from phrases like neighborhood standards. As Simone returned to her seat, Jaden, sitting in his adoptive mother's lap, waved. His eyes gleamed. Simone smiled, not with pride, but with recognition, because in his face she saw something that hadn't been there before, a future not built from the ashes of revenge, but brick by brick from reform and trust. The trial ended, but not like a final chapter, more like an opening door, not with a punitive slam, but with a question left hanging in the air. Do we want to live in communities built on sameness or on respect for difference? Simone didn't need an answer today. She just needed to know that by choosing not to let anger write the ending, she had preserved the spirit of this fight, not vengeance, but reconstruction, to force systems that once chose exclusion to relearn coexistence, and to make justice not the siren arriving late, but part of the foundation of a place we dare to call home. Not long after the trial, Simone returned to her daily routine. Only this time, the silence felt different. No more strange SUVs circling the block, no more anonymous letters, no more eyes watching from behind curtains. Windmere Grove had quieted in a whole new way, as if the entire neighborhood was learning how to exist without a mask to hide behind. But in that silence, what echoed loudest was her. Simone didn't take a single interview request. She declined the calls from national TV networks, ignored the emails asking to write her life story, and turned down invitations to speak at Women Who Create Change panels. She didn't stand on any stage. She didn't post a speech online. For Simone, the spotlight was never the prize. Justice didn't need to be polished for public appeal. And if the truth required applause to survive, then it had never been strong enough to begin with. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that stillness, a small article appeared, not on the front page of a major outlet, not boosted by verified names with millions of followers, just a modest column in a local paper called the Beacon Journal, written by a young journalist with no brand, but with a sharp eye for what others often missed. The title read, "The Woman Who Wouldn't Bow to the System." No drama, no detailed retelling of the trial, no attempt to crown Simone a hero or icon. It simply described a woman who moved into a quiet neighborhood, was met with unspoken threats from those who had the power to write internal rules, and who, quietly, without fanfare, made the entire street look itself in the mirror. The writer observed, "Not everyone changes the world with a speech. Some do it simply by refusing to leave. And sometimes what echoes loudest comes from the one who doesn't need to say a word." The article spread, not rapidly, but steadily, not because it was promoted, but because each person who read it felt compelled to pass it on. It found its way into school newsletters, hospital bulletin boards, online parent groups, veteran circles, teacher forums. People who had known what it was like to be silenced by policies written in rooms they weren't invited into. When a neighbor once asked Simone why she hadn't accepted any interviews, she simply replied, "Because I don't need to retell it to know it happened." For her, the most powerful outcome was never about being recognized. It was about making others believe they could do the same without needing permission, without needing applause, without having to represent anything but their refusal to disappear. In the weeks after the trial, a few letters were left on her doorstep. No return address, no signature, just a few handwritten lines. "I used to think I wasn't brave enough. I'm rewriting our HOA bylaws. Thank you for not staying silent like I did." Marcus read each one. He kept them in a small wooden box in their study, labeling the lid with a single note. No response needed. Just keep. As for Simone, she still watered the plants, still swapped out the flowers in the vase, still read quietly on the porch each morning. Her posture was unchanged. No sign of triumph in her walk, but everyone in the neighborhood, whether they admitted it or not, knew her presence was different now. She wasn't just a woman living here. She was a boundary, a line they wouldn't dare cross again. A reminder that silence isn't invisibility, and that someone is always watching, in ways that matter. Jayton now walked to school without lowering his head. He still carried the little toy police car Simone gave him, but no longer tucked it under his shirt. He held it out in his hand, like a small, invisible shield he'd learned how to wield. Power, Simone understood, didn't always speak. Sometimes it lived in the way you walked through doubt without changing pace, in choosing not to step back, even when no one else is standing beside you, and in staying, not to prove yourself, but so others know they can stay too, and never have to ask permission. That's the quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't shout, but still makes a system tremble. In the weeks following the trial, just when everything seemed to be slipping back into routine, one truth became clearer than ever. No one could dismiss what happened in Windmere Grove as an isolated incident anymore. That event, for many who once looked the other way and thought, "This too shall pass," had become a crack in the glass, one too sharp to unsee. Like a fracture in bulletproof glass, it might not shatter things outright, but once it's there, no one can pretend the surface is intact. One Thursday morning, as operations began as usual at Langford & Sons, one of the state's largest real estate conglomerates and a longtime partner of Monroe Holdings, a letter appeared on the desk of the Eastern Regional VP. No courier, no tracking number, no return address. Every edge of the envelope was clean, cold, and precise. On the front, in bold black type pressed into the paper like it had been stamped with steel, just one line: "Next time, it won't be a warning." Inside, nothing. No paper, no message. But it didn't need one. For someone in that seat, someone used to writing people out of neighborhoods through smart zoning and paper-thin legalese, it said everything, and it said it loud. News of the letter spread fast, just not through the press. No headlines, no media frenzy. It moved in encrypted texts, whispered phone calls, behind closed doors without windows. No one dared say Simone's name directly, but everyone understood. This was no longer about a black woman who stood her ground. This was the consequence of misjudging someone the system once labeled a disruptive exception. Because Simone, through nothing but her quiet, unshakable resolve, had turned a battle they thought was personal into a systemic takedown. And it cut through the foundations Langford & Sons and others had built for decades. Pseudo-HOs posing as community stewards, policies worded to filter out people they didn't want to share space with, not through violence, but through smooth-talking legislation and engineered bylaws. Now, no one in the racially skewed real estate game could tell themselves they were just following procedure, because that very procedure had been exposed, clause by clause, contract by contract, email by email. Simone didn't show up in press conferences to stake her claim. She didn't issue manifestos or call others to rise, because true power, as she learned her first day in uniform, doesn't lie in who yells the loudest. It lives in the weight your presence leaves behind, especially in rooms where no one thought they'd ever have to answer to anyone. After the letter surfaced, Langford's regional offices across 3 states quietly began internal reviews of resident evictions from the past 5 years. Denied complaints were reopened, community safety contracts faced unannounced audits, certain HOA bylaws were flagged and struck for violating basic civil protections. No public apologies, no massive takedowns, just movement, silent but undeniable, as if even the sturdiest walls had heard the sound of their future collapse. Back in Windermere Grove, Simone never mentioned the letter. She didn't need to. She spent her time with Marcus reviewing proposed bylaws for neighborhoods, now asking for their insight. She met with young lawyers from housing justice fellowships, not to retell her story, but to help them build reform proposals from the ground up. One late afternoon, while pruning roses on her porch, Jaden came over with a drawing, himself in a police uniform, standing beside a tall woman in a button-down shirt with a comms mic around her neck. "You know what?" he said. "My classmate said her mom told her this lady is the one who stopped the bad guys without fighting." Simone looked at the drawing and let out a soft laugh. "Not exactly," she said, gently brushing back his curls. "I didn't stop anyone, I just made sure they had nowhere left to hide." That's the difference between revenge and redefinition. Not swinging back harder, but rewriting the rules so no one gets pushed out simply for walking in with the wrong skin tone. And now, every person who once believed they stood above the law understood this. The woman they overlooked, the one who never shouted, never posed, never led with slogans, was the one who rewrote the playbook, quietly, but irreversibly. Because sometimes the most terrifying warning isn't a shout, it's one sentence, from someone who never has to say it twice. Simone Bennett's story didn't begin with a battle. It began with something as simple as watering flowers in a yard the system had quietly decided she didn't deserve. But from that silence she was forced to live within, she became a voice no one could ignore. Through resilience and legitimacy, she didn't retaliate against a racist network, she dismantled it, not to win for herself, but to rebuild fairness for every child who's ever fallen asleep afraid. And what about you? When you see injustice, will you bow your head, or will you step forward and become someone who rewrites the rules, the way Simone did? If this story resonated with you, hit like, share it, and subscribe, because sometimes one voice choosing to stay can shake an entire system into seeing itself.